The grand auditorium of Oxford University's Sheldonian Theatre was packed to capacity on this crisp October evening in 2023, its historic wooden galleries and ornate ceiling, witnessing what had been billed as one of the most unusual intellectual confrontations in recent memory. The Oxford Union, famous for hosting debates between world leaders, Nobel laureates, and renowned thinkers, had arranged something unprecedented, a formal debate on the existence of God between Dr. Richard Blackstone, one of Britain's most prominent atheist philosophers and author of the best-selling The God Delusion Revisited, and Ozzy Osbourne, the 74-year-old rock legend whose recent public statements about his Christian faith had surprised many and sparked intense curiosity about the depth of his theological understanding. The theatre buzzed with an electric mixture of anticipation and skepticism. In the front rows sat distinguished professors of theology, philosophy, and literature, while the upper galleries were filled with students, journalists, and music fans who had somehow managed to secure tickets to what many were calling either a brilliant publicity stunt or a genuine clash of worldviews. The betting odds in the student bookshops had heavily favoured Dr. Blackstone, a Cambridge-educated intellectual known for his devastating critiques of religious belief and his ability to dismantle faith-based arguments with surgical precision. Dr. Blackstone, 52, sat at the debate podium looking every inch the distinguished academic in his perfectly tailored tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, and silk tie. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his posture conveyed absolute confidence, and his expression suggested barely concealed amusement at the prospect of intellectually dismantling a rock star who had wandered out of his depth into the realm of serious philosophical discourse. If you're enjoying this incredible intellectual showdown, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. It helps us bring you more amazing moments from academic history. Across from him sat Ozzy Osbourne, looking surprisingly dignified in a simple black suit, his famous cross necklace visible beneath his open collar. Despite the slight tremor in his hands from Parkinson's disease, his eyes were bright and alert, and those who knew him well could sense the quiet intensity that had always lurked beneath his wild public persona. He had spent weeks preparing for this debate, working with theological scholars and reading extensively on philosophy of religion, determined to prove that his faith was more than just a celebrity's superficial embrace of spirituality. The moderator, Professor Margaret Whitfield, one of Oxford's most respected philosophers of religion, introduced the evening's format. Tonight's debate will address the proposition, God exists, and faith represents a rational response to the human condition. Dr. Blackstone will argue against this proposition, while Mr. Osborne will defend it. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for their opening statement, followed by rebuttals and audience questions. Dr. Blackstone rose first, his confidence radiating throughout the hall as he began what many expected would be a systematic demolition of religious belief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his crisp Oxford accent carrying easily to the back of the theatre, "we are here tonight to discuss what is, perhaps the most important question in human history, whether there exists a supernatural being who created and governs the universe. I am here to tell you, with the full weight of scientific evidence and logical reasoning behind me, that no such being exists." He paused for effect, scanning the audience with the assurance of someone who had never lost a formal debate. "The proposition we're examining tonight asks us to believe in something for which there is no empirical evidence, no logical necessity, and no rational justification. In the 21st century, with our understanding of cosmology, evolution, neuroscience, and psychology, the idea of God has become not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to human progress." Dr. Blackstone launched into a polished presentation that touched on the problem of evil, the argument from divine hiddenness, the evolutionary explanation for religious belief, and the incompatibility between scientific understanding and supernatural claims. His delivery was flawless, his logic seemed airtight, and his examples were devastating. "Religious faith," he concluded after 12 minutes of intellectual artillery, "is nothing more than wishful thinking elevated to the status of virtue. It is the refusal to accept the universe as it actually is in favor of comforting delusions about cosmic purpose and divine love. Humanity's greatest achievements have come through reason, science, and the courage to face reality without the crutch of supernatural belief. The audience applauded politely, though many seemed somewhat overwhelmed by the professor's intellectual firepower. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances that seemed to say, "How is a rock star going to respond to that?" Ozzy rose slowly from his chair, the silence in the hall becoming almost oppressive as hundreds of eyes focused on him. When he began to speak, his Birmingham accent seemed oddly comforting after Dr. Blackstone's clinical precision. "Thank you, Professor Whitfield. Dr. Blackstone, that was very impressive. You've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about these questions, and I respect your intellectual honesty in following your reasoning where it leads." The graciousness of his opening surprised many in the audience who had expected either defensive anger or bumbling inadequacy. "But I'd like to start with a personal question, if I may," Ozzy continued, his voice growing stronger. "Dr. Blackstone, have you ever been so broken, so completely hopeless, that you wanted to die?" The directness of the question caught the philosopher off guard. Well, I don't see how personal anecdotes are relevant to—" "Bear with me," Ozzy interrupted gently, "because I think the question of God's existence isn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. It's a deeply personal question about the nature of reality, meaning, and human experience." He walked slightly away from the podium, his movement commanding the attention of everyone in the hall. 20 years ago, I was sitting in a hotel room in London with a bottle of pills in my hand, ready to end my life. I had everything money could buy: fame, success, luxury, but I felt completely empty inside. I was addicted to drugs and alcohol. I was destroying my relationships with everyone I loved, and I couldn't see any reason to continue existing. The hall was completely silent now, the academic atmosphere transformed by the raw honesty of his words. Now, Dr. Blackstone would probably say that what happened next was just brain chemistry, maybe some kind of neurological event triggered by stress or substance withdrawal. But in that moment, I felt something I can only describe as a presence, not a voice, not a vision, but an overwhelming sense that I was loved, that my life had value, and that there was hope even in my darkest moment. Ozzy paused, looking directly at Dr. Blackstone. "You can call that delusion if you want. You can say it was just my brain's way of coping with despair, but that moment changed everything. It started me on a journey that led to sobriety, to healing my relationships, to finding purpose beyond just my own pleasure and success." "Mr. Osbourne," Dr. Blackstone interjected, "surely you can see that subjective experiences, however moving, don't constitute evidence for objective truth. People have profound experiences under all sorts of circumstances." "You're absolutely right," Ozzy agreed, surprising the philosopher with his concession. "Personal experience alone doesn't prove God's existence. But here's what I want to challenge you on: your assumption that only empirical scientific evidence counts as valid knowledge." The audience leaned forward, sensing that the debate was taking an unexpected turn. "You mentioned earlier that science has made God unnecessary," Ozzy continued. "But science tells us how things work, not why they exist or what they mean. Science can describe the mechanisms of the universe, but it can't explain why there's something rather than nothing, why the universe appears fine-tuned for life, or why human beings have an almost universal sense that life should have meaning and purpose." Dr. Blackstone looked slightly taken aback. This was not the fumbling amateur performance he had expected. "Furthermore," Ozzy pressed on, "your materialist worldview faces some serious problems that you haven't addressed. If consciousness is just an emergent property of brain activity, how do you account for the unified, subjective experience of being human? If morality is just evolutionary programming, why do we feel obligated to transcend our selfish impulses? If love is just chemical reactions, why does it feel so fundamentally different from other neurochemical processes?" The philosophical depth of these questions clearly surprised Dr. Blackstone, who had expected to debate a celebrity's superficial religiosity, not engage with someone who had clearly studied the fundamental issues. "These are interesting philosophical puzzles," Dr. Blackstone conceded, "but they hardly constitute proof of divine existence. The fact that we don't yet fully understand consciousness or morality doesn't mean we should invoke supernatural explanations." "You're right," Ozzy agreed again. But you're asking me to prove God's existence using only the tools that your worldview considers valid. That's like asking someone to prove the beauty of music using only mathematical equations. The tools might be valuable, but they're not capable of capturing the full reality of what we're trying to understand. He walked closer to Dr. Blackstone, his voice taking on more intensity. Let me ask you something else, Doctor. In your worldview, what is the ultimate source of meaning and value? If we're just collections of atoms that accidentally achieved consciousness on a random planet in an indifferent universe, what makes human life valuable? What makes love more meaningful than hate, or justice more important than oppression? Dr. Blackstone shifted uncomfortably. We create our own meaning. Human values emerge from our nature as social beings, our capacity for empathy and reason. But why should I care about my nature as a social being if it's just the product of blind evolutionary forces? Ozzy interrupted. Why should I value empathy and reason if they're just survival mechanisms that helped our ancestors reproduce? You're borrowing meaning and value from a theistic worldview while denying the source that makes that meaning possible. The audience was now completely riveted. This was not the intellectual mismatch many had expected, but a genuine philosophical confrontation. Dr. Blackstone, Ozzy continued, his voice growing more passionate. Your atheism isn't just a neutral scientific position. It's a faith commitment of its own. Faith that the universe is ultimately meaningless, that consciousness is an accident, that love and beauty and moral obligation are just illusions created by evolutionary processes. That's not faith, Dr. Blackstone protested. That's following the evidence where it leads. Is it? Ozzy challenged. Because the evidence seems to point in multiple directions. Yes, evolution explains how life develops, but it doesn't explain why anything exists to evolve in the first place. Yes, neuroscience shows correlations between brain states and mental experiences, but it doesn't explain why there's subjective experience at all. Yes, psychology can describe how moral intuitions develop, but it can't explain why we feel obligated to transcend our programming and pursue genuine goodness. He paused, looking around the hall. The God I believe in isn't a God of the gaps, something we invoke to explain what science can't. The God I believe in is the source and ground of everything that science studies. Science works because the universe is rational and comprehensible. Morality matters because we're created in the image of perfect goodness. Love is real because we're designed for relationship with the ultimate source of love. Dr. Blackstone was clearly struggling to regain his footing. Mr. Osbourne, these are interesting philosophical speculations, but surely you can see that they're not rigorous arguments. You're essentially arguing that because you find theism emotionally satisfying, it must be true. No, Ozzy replied firmly. I'm arguing that theism makes better sense of the full range of human experience than atheism does. I'm arguing that a worldview that can account for both the scientific understanding of the universe and the reality of consciousness, meaning, morality, and love, is more intellectually satisfying than one that has to explain away half of what makes us human. The hall was electric with tension as the two men faced off. But more than that, Ozzy continued, his voice softening slightly, I'm arguing that the question of God's existence isn't just intellectual, it's existential. It's about whether human life has ultimate meaning and purpose, whether love and sacrifice and moral, courage matter in the deepest sense, whether there's hope beyond the grave. He looked directly at Dr. Blackstone with something approaching compassion. Your atheism might work fine when you're sitting in your comfortable office at Cambridge, surrounded by books and admiring students. But how does it hold up at 3 a.m. when you're facing your own mortality? How does it comfort you when someone you love is dying? How does it motivate you to pursue justice when it would be easier to look out for yourself? Dr. Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, clearly affected by the personal challenge. I find meaning in my relationships, in my work, in trying to reduce suffering and increase human flourishing, he said finally, his voice less confident than before. That's beautiful, Ozzy replied sincerely. But where does that impulse come from? Why do you care about reducing suffering if suffering is just an electrochemical process in accidentally evolved brains? Why does human flourishing matter if humans are just temporary arrangements of atoms that will eventually return to dust? Because Because we're conscious beings capable of experience, Dr. Blackstone answered, but his voice lacked conviction. Exactly, Ozzy exclaimed. You instinctively recognize that consciousness matters, that experience has value, that some things are worth pursuing, even if they don't benefit you personally. But your worldview can't explain why any of that should be true. The audience was transfixed by this exchange, watching a rock star challenge one of Britain's most prominent intellectuals on the deepest questions of human existence. Dr. Blackstone, Ozzy said, his voice becoming gentler, I don't think you're really an atheist in your heart. I think you're someone who cares deeply about truth, about reducing suffering, about human dignity and flourishing. Those aren't atheistic impulses. They're profoundly spiritual ones. You're essentially claiming, Dr. Blackstone said weakly, that anyone who cares about morality must believe in God. Not must, Ozzy corrected. But I'm saying that caring about morality makes more sense in a universe where morality reflects ultimate reality rather than just evolutionary programming. I'm saying that someone who dedicates their life to truth and human welfare is living as if God exists, even if they don't believe in him intellectually. The hall erupted in spontaneous applause, clearly moved by the unexpected depth and grace of Ozzy's argument. Professor Whitfield called for the rebuttal period, but Dr. Blackstone seemed genuinely shaken. His response was noticeably less confident, focusing mainly on restating his earlier arguments, rather than addressing the fundamental challenges Ozzy had raised. Ozzy's rebuttal was brief but powerful. Dr. Blackstone represents the best of what atheistic thinking can offer: intellectual rigor, moral concern, dedication to truth. But I would argue that these very qualities point beyond materialism towards something transcendent. The fact that we can recognize truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty suggests that we're more than just complex arrangements of matter. It suggests we're spiritual beings in a universe that has spiritual as well as physical dimensions. During the question period, audience members posed challenges to both speakers, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted. Dr. Blackstone's answers seemed increasingly defensive, while Ozzy responded to questions with a combination of philosophical sophistication and personal authenticity that surprised even his supporters. A theology student asked, Mr. Osbourne, how do you respond to the argument that religious belief is just wishful thinking? I'd ask, Ozzy replied, whether the desire for meaning and purpose might actually be evidence that meaning and purpose exist. We have desires for food because food exists, desires for love because love is real, desires for knowledge because truth is attainable. Maybe our deepest spiritual longings point to spiritual realities rather than just evolutionary accidents. A philosophy professor challenged, but surely the problem of evil undermines any argument for a benevolent God. The problem of evil is real, Ozzy acknowledged. I've experienced it personally through addiction, family struggles, and illness. But the fact that we recognize evil as evil, that we feel outraged by injustice, and motivated to fight against suffering, doesn't that suggest that goodness is the fundamental reality and evil is a departure from it? In an atheistic universe, why should evil be a problem rather than just another natural phenomenon? By the end of the evening, something unprecedented had occurred. Dr. Blackstone, for the first time in his career, publicly acknowledged that his opponent had raised challenges to atheism that he couldn't easily dismiss. Mr. Osbourne has reminded me, he said in his closing statement, that the questions surrounding God's existence are more complex and personally significant than I sometimes acknowledge in my academic work. While I remain skeptical of theistic claims, I recognize that my own commitment to truth and human welfare might point toward transcendent realities. That pure materialism struggles to explain. The debate ended with a standing ovation from much of the audience, not necessarily because they had been converted to Ozzy's position, but because they had witnessed a genuine intellectual and spiritual encounter that elevated both participants. In the weeks following the debate, clips of the exchange went viral across social media and academic platforms. Philosophy professors began assigning transcripts of the debate in their courses, and several prominent atheist thinkers published responses attempting to address the challenges Ozzy had raised. Dr. Blackstone himself began incorporating some of Ozzy's arguments into his lectures, using them as examples of the most sophisticated challenges to materialistic atheism. While he didn't abandon his atheism, he became notably more humble in his claims about the certainty of his position. That debate changed how I think about the relationship between intellectual positions and lived experience, he said in a later interview. Mr. Osbourne showed me that someone can have profound philosophical insights without formal academic training, and that the existential dimensions of belief deserve more serious consideration than I had previously given them. For Ozzy, the debate represented vindication that his faith was intellectually respectable as well as personally meaningful. He began accepting more speaking engagements at universities and theological conferences, becoming an unexpected voice for thoughtful, academically informed Christianity. That night at Oxford taught me that faith and reason don't have to be enemies, he reflected. My experience of God's grace led me to explore the intellectual foundations of belief, and I discovered that Christianity has profound philosophical resources for understanding reality, meaning, and human nature. The debate ultimately became a landmark moment in contemporary discussions about faith and reason, showing that the conversation between believers and non-believers could be conducted with mutual respect, intellectual rigor, and genuine openness to challenge and growth. Years later, both men would cite the Oxford debate as a formative experience that shaped their understanding not just of their own positions, but of the complexity and significance of humanity's deepest questions about existence, meaning, and transcendence. Thank you for reading this incredible story of intellectual courage and respectful dialogue. If it moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. It helps us continue sharing stories that remind us of the power of thoughtful conversation and the importance of engaging seriously with life's biggest questions.